So how many of you started using Angular and thought it was awesome? Yeah, I thought so as well. When Lyft, that's with an I, when we started making the web version of our iPhone app, I started using Angular, and the two-way binding blew me away. I thought this was great. This is totally awesome. I'm going to build everything so quickly now with less code. And it was. But then suddenly I realized that, shit, I've been doing it all wrong. And I wasn't writing extensible code. My code wasn't architectured properly. How many of you kind of hit that wall where you hit this like steep learning curve, right? So then I learned about services, modules, started putting together my code in reusable pieces. And then I hit another wall. And I was like, oh my God, there's like performance issues. My views were getting more complex. What are these things called directives, and how do I write one? So then I learned about writing your own custom directives. That dried up my views a lot. Really working with promises to do asynchronous events. And so I'm going to show you how to kind of level up as well. So you can think of this as the guide to, after you built your first app in Angular, how do you start building things a better way? So let's get started. Oh, the sound wasn't hooked up. Did anyone hear that? I'll do it again. So you guys have looked at the Angular documentation, and you see this, right? You declare a module, you assign it to a variable. Whoa. And you attach, you register some stuff to it, you make a controller. And as all good JavaScript developers know, you're like, what the heck are all these global variables doing? Well, it turns out that you're actually supposed to register things to your modules by just asking Angular for your module back. So as you can see at the top here, when we declare a module, we pass in the dependencies. That's the second parameter. If we don't pass in any dependencies, then Angular will know to go get the module you declared earlier and then return it back to you and allow you to register whatever you want on it. So let's talk more about modules. In the Angular guide, they recommend that you have these different modules. One for services that you attach all your services to, one for directives that you attach all your directives to. How many of you do this? Yeah, so I started doing this as well, and then I realized that it's actually a really bad pattern. And then what I started doing was actually splitting up my code by feature. So I have a module for, let's say I have a users feature. It can depend on other services like a utility. I have groups. And the great thing is that now my app can depend on the users feature and this groups feature. But then I can have a separate Angular app. Let's say I have an admin app that allows you to manage a bunch of users, and it wants to use all the things that I've created under users as well. So now you can do that. You can create separate Angular apps. So the next interesting thing is that you don't have to register all of your routes in one module. So instead of having like this huge routes file, you can separate your routes by feature. So I have a whole bunch of routes under users. I can just register them in my users module and then still have everything work the way you expect in your main app if you include the users module. And the other great thing about this pattern is that, as Mishko said earlier in the day, that Angular is going to support asynchronous loading in the future. So if you already have your module split up by feature, then you can actually take advantage of asynchronous loading. If you have all of your services in one module, then it doesn't really matter. You have to load all of your services at the same time. So now what about services? So in the Angular tutorial, there's no mention of services until like the last step. And so when I first started, I wrote all my code in a controller. How many of you did this? No one? Okay, I wasn't the only one. So my first version, I only had controllers. My second version, I pulled almost everything out into services. And so the whole fat model, skinny controller concept works here as well. Of course, you don't want to have like really fat services either. You can modularize your services and break them down. But one thing that's really confusing about services is how do you actually register them? So there's, you think, oh, it's a service, so I should call .service to register my service, right? Well, you can, and you can use the service to register your service if you have an existing kind of pseudo-classical object. And if you want to wrap that and add that to Angular's dependency injection system, then you can use service. But most of the time, you just want to register something as a function, and that's when you want to use factory. So most of the time you want to use factory, except if you have existing things that are already written as like JavaScript classes, even though there's not like real classes, then you can wrap them in service. But really, the thing about factory and service is that they're just convenience functions into provider. So you actually want to go down and write a provider if you need to do any configuration before the service gets instantiated. So let's say that we have this Mario service, it returns a Mario, and we want to be able to set the size depending on which mode you load the service in. So here we can configure Mario beforehand and then use the $get, which is a special method on provider that needs to be set to provide the rest of the function. So going back to the factory is used when you don't need to do any configuration ahead of time, which is most of the time. So the factory, all it does is that it returns just the $get. So it calls $get for you. All right, let's move on to asynchronous events. As JavaScript developers, we're used to dealing with asynchronous events. Everything is asynchronous. And when I first started using Angular, I used this pattern a lot, where, hey, I have something that I need to know about, so I'm just going to broadcast that event on root scope, and then in some random controller, I'm going to listen for that event. And that works well. The Angular eventing system works very well, except what happens if the data doesn't load? So here, it's harder to deal with error conditions. Right? If the data doesn't load and we're waiting for it to load, what do? Do we kind of stuff the error into the same event? Do we create another event that we listen on for the error? It just gets messy. And what I realized is that you should actually be using promises. So how many of you are familiar with the promise API in Angular? Great. So Angular has its own implementation of the promise API through the queue service. And let's rewrite what we had before, where we load some random data in a service, and then we need to use it in a controller. So the thing to know about promises is that there are two separate entities. There's a deferred object, which we create on the first line, and then the promise is a property on that deferred object. So here we expose a method on our service to get our Mario, and that just returns a promise, because we don't have a Mario yet. And then later on, when we have a Mario, we can resolve the data on that deferred object. And similarly, now we have an error condition. If it errors out, we can reject the promise, and we can return an error. And now in our controller, we can just call getMario directly. We get returned a promise. Then we can call then on the promise, which is the main method you want to call on a promise. And you can add your callbacks to the then function. So if we get data, we can do something with Mario. And if we get an error, then we can do something with the error. But this still looks kind of complex. And you're probably wondering, like, why do you even need to do this? The thing to know is that in Angular specifically, you can inject promises directly into the view. So this is really helpful if you don't need to, for example, worry about errors, at least at the controller level. So if you don't need to do any code with Mario, you just want to display it, you can just assign the promise directly to a scope variable and expose it in the view as if it was the resolved object. So that is a very useful pattern. There are many other benefits to using promises. It allows you to chain promises together. So if you're waiting on one event before you have to do something and then you have to do something else, you can avoid that dreaded like nested callbacks that you sometimes get with regular callbacks. And instead you can call .then and then .then on that and keep it in a straight line. Q also has some other useful functions like all. If you're waiting on, let's say you need Mario and you need Peach before you can do something and you don't know what order they're going to come in, you can pass 2 or more promises into q.all, and then q.all will resolve when all of the promises resolve, or reject if any of them error out. And that's very useful. Another method that's useful is q.when. So you want to use q.when if you're not sure if you're going to have a promise or you already have the object. So a common example is maybe you have some cache data and you only want to go out and fetch something if you can't find that object in the cache. But if you're calling it, you don't want to have to figure out if sometimes you're going to get the object back and sometimes you're going to get a promise back. So q.when allows you to wrap regular JavaScript objects into promises that resolve right away so that you can deal with things like that always in an asynchronous manner instead of having to worry about what the thing is you're getting back. Promises also allow you to write interceptors. So this is really useful for global error handling. If you need to, say you want to add a retry every time you get a certain error code back, you can do that invisibly. So your final promise will resolve if your retry works, but it'll reject only if your retry doesn't work. So promises also allow you to resolve your routes. And this, I thought this was kind of a hidden feature, but now I use it everywhere. And it allows you to pass in a resolve property into route provider. And what that does is that it takes a promise, and it'll only allow you to visit that route if the promise resolves. So this is really useful if you want to prevent your users from going to a page that they can't access because whatever it is that needs to be shown doesn't exist or errors out. And what resolve will do is it'll inject the thing that you pass into resolve, this property here, and add it as a dependency, as a final resolved object. So you can use it right away in your controller. All right, we're at the boss level. I wish I had a sound effect for this one. You can actually do a lot. Whoa, cool. You can do a lot with Angular's built-in directives. They're really powerful. But at some point, you want to write your own custom directives. And it's really when you want to have reusable components. You have all this behavior tied to your view, and you want to be able to just plug and play that component into different pages. Or you need to manipulate the DOM. If you're manipulating the DOM in a controller, please stop and write a directive instead. So I'll take you through a more complex example of a custom directive, and along the way we'll talk about all the things that go into a directive. So here we have a directive called enemy, and it's going to create one of the enemies in the Mario world. So we can pass in the enemy type, how many lives that enemy has, and then what should happen if the enemy is destroyed. So let's look at what a directive definition object for something like this looks like. So a directive definition object is what you pass, oh, that should say module, is what you should pass into what you should return, the constructor that you should return from a directive. And it has a whole bunch of properties, which I'm not going to go into every single one, but I'm just going to go into the ones that I think are particularly confusing. Well, the first one is restrict. And when you first look at a directive, you're like, what do these bunch of letters mean? Well, it's pretty simple. E means that your directive can only be an element. A is if it can be an attribute. And C is if you can declare your directive as a class. And there's also M, but I've never actually seen anyone use it, and that's when you declare your directive as a comment. The key thing to note here is that you can use a combination. A common one is EA, so your directive can be declared as an element or an attribute. Okay, so now we talk about scopes. This is the thing that seems to trip a lot of people up. When you don't declare a scope, then by default, it just uses the existing parent scope. So anything that's on your parent scope automatically is available to your directive, which is probably not a good idea. If you pass in true, then your directive will get a new scope, but it'll still inherit all of the properties on your parent scope. So usually, your directive should use an isolated scope. And you create an isolated scope by passing in an object into the scope property. And if you've ever seen a directive, you'll notice that it uses some random symbols. And at first, it's just the syntax is pretty confusing, but I'll go through each one. So if you pass in something and you define it with an @ sign, that means that you're passing it in as a string, and that can be an interpolated string, as you can see here. If you pass it in as an equal sign, that means you're asking Angular to data bind that property. So here, you'll notice that there's no braces, it's just enemy.lives, and that is an object, or in this case, a property on an object. And finally, this one's not used as often, but you can pass in an ampersand, and that means that whatever that property is a function or an expression. And that allows you to call it within your directive. So it's useful for callbacks from within your directive back out to your parent scope. So let's say we've set up these scopes, but how do we actually access these things from inside our directive? So in later versions of Angular, if you just said like scope.type, then you would be able to access that. In earlier versions of Angular, that wouldn't work. But even let's say that you can access that and you can assign it, doesn't mean that outside of Angular, if that property has changed, that you'll get notified, because now you're in your own special world inside the directive. So what you need to do is do an observe if it's a string, like an interpolated value, or do a watch if it's an object, a data bound object. So another thing that comes up is how do you communicate between directives? So normally you want to coordinate data between directives through a controller. But what if like you have two directives that are actually on the same element? So here we have a new directive, Mario, and we have another directive called fire mode. So we could have made fire mode just part of Mario, but let's say we wanted to add fire mode to some other character, like Peach could have fire mode too. So we make it a separate directive. We want to be able to turn fire mode on and off, but if you have two directives on the same element, only one of them can have an isolated scope. So here, Mario has an isolated scope. It has a property for fire mode. But down here in the fire mode directive, we can actually read our own property, fire mode, because it just comes in as an attribute, which is the third parameter that gets passed into your link function. And then similarly as before, we can observe that attribute. And if Mario over here turns fire mode on and off, we'll know about it, and we can turn fire mode on and off on that element. So as I mentioned before, one of the key reasons you want to use a directive is to work with the DOM directly. And a lot of us do that through jQuery, because jQuery is awesome. I'm going to go to a local version of my presentation, because I think this actually didn't finish loading. Sorry about that. Whoa. What is happening? Okay. Yeah, this is the star mode. Okay, wrapping jQuery events. So let's say we're in fire mode, and we want to be able to, anytime we click anywhere, create like a fireball and then shoot it at where we're clicking. So we can attach an event to listen to, and because we're good citizens, we namespace our click event, and we just listen for it anywhere it happens on the page. And when the user clicks, we create a fireball and we shoot it at it. The thing you want to do is also, of course, deregister your global click handler when fire mode is not on. And you might be wondering, like, what happens if my directive goes away or something like that? How do I go back and clean up these things? So a scope always has a destroy method on it, $destroy. And you can attach any type of cleanup, like deregistering your click handlers inside that method. So now, back on our enemy directive, if we click on an enemy with a fireball, we want that enemy to go away. So here, we can listen on, oh, sorry, I actually forgot to mention. Here when we click on when we shoot the fireball, we find out where the user clicked, we shoot the fireball at it, and then we also create our own special event, which is an attack event, and we trigger that on the element that was clicked on. So now our enemy can listen for that special event, which is attack. In real life, you probably want to namespace this as well. And decrease the life on it. And then if the lives are 0, we remove it, and we can call the callback that we set up earlier to tell our parent scope that, hey, this enemy has been destroyed, do something. All right, who wants to see this in action? So we have our enemies. This stuff is actually happening outside of the directives, so in the controller. If we didn't have fire mode, Mario becomes small again, and if you click around, nothing happens. If we enable fire mode, sweet, fireballs. And Goombas, well, they're easy, right? You just click on them, they disappear. But Bowser, well, you need to click a few more times. There you go. Okay. That is the end. So the slides are online. I know there's a number of code samples, so you can go through them on the online slides. And I'll take any questions. No questions. Everyone already knows Angular super well.
So you said that that's kind of the boss level. So what's the level beyond that? What do you see as the next level beyond promises, directives, wrapping jQuery events?
Oh, I don't know. I don't think I'm there yet. This is my level. I can't teach you how to get to the next level.
What do you think what would you like to learn next about Angular and
well,
work
first
more
I have to refactor all my old code. But animations that are coming in 1.2. All right, well, I'll be up here if you want to. Oh, there's a microphone. Yeah.
What's your opinion of the Yeoman Angular C project?
I don't know. I haven't really looked at it.
Okay, because it has an opinion as to what best practices are in terms of directory structures and so forth. So I was wondering if the module structure that you had suggested works well with it, plays well with it, or does something else, but you don't know. So it's okay.
Okay. Sorry.
Thanks so much.
I haven't looked at it.
Hello. I just have a question in terms of the technology itself, AngularJS, since you obviously have used it for a while. How would you compare it with other JavaScript-based frameworks? And specifically, where do you think its strengths are compared to others? In which projects would you use it?
Yeah, so I haven't used Ember, but I did use Backbone a little while ago, and I felt like in Angular there was just a lot less code to write. The two-way binding is pretty magical, and there's a lot of things you can do. It's much more comprehensive and powerful than a library like Backbone. So it depends on what you need, but I think for a more complex web app, Angular is definitely the way to go.
So when you say complex, I mean, do you feel there are certain capabilities that makes it better for, let's say, games versus enterprise level web applications versus, social applications? What is your take on that?
Yeah, I think definitely for enterprise apps, like any type of CRUD app that is complex and you're just dealing with a lot of objects and stuff like that, it would work well. I showed a game, but I'm no game developer. I have no idea. I don't imagine you would choose Angular as the primary way to write a game, but I don't know.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So you talked about the Animate coming pretty soon?
Yeah, but I haven't really looked at it yet, so I can't answer any questions about it.
Oh, sorry. I was actually going to ask, I know in Angular you try to keep us from using too much DOM manipulation.
Yeah.
I was going to ask if the new Animate feature that's coming is going to make it so that you can pretty much stay out of the DOM manipulation world, easy calls, but
yeah, I'm not sure. I think there's always a place for jQuery just because there's so much jQuery code out there. Like I myself have a lot of libraries that I've written in jQuery, and it's not possible to rewrite them overnight, right? So I think there's always a reason to wrap those in Angular and be able to use them in Angular without having to rewrite everything in pure Angular.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, you said you had modules for specific features, right? Mm-hmm. And did you try to use, is there any way you try to adopt the required JS way of loading modules lazily? I know Angular has plans of loading.
Yeah, so Angular doesn't support asynchronous loading right now. the way the dependency injection works is that everything has to be there at the time it's injected. So, but in the future, version of Angular, that should be supported.
So basically, any Angular application has to have all the JavaScript loaded up front.
Yeah, okay. and that's a drawback too. Like for example, your services all share the same namespace. Like if you declare something, they all share the same namespace. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
I mean, your development process, one of the things Angular is supposed to do is make unit testing easier. Did you, were you writing unit tests as you went along, and how was that process, if you did?
Yeah, I did write controller specs and service specs. I didn't write E2E tests, but I felt like the unit specs were sufficient. Yeah. Okay. But definitely using Testacular, or now called Karma, it does make that whole process easier, and Angular is definitely one of the libraries that treats testing very seriously, and it provides a lot of tools to mock all the objects you need, like HTTP. It provides an HTTP backend to mock HTTP calls. So a lot of things you have to do, like handle asynchronous events, can be done in tests, so it allows you to test JavaScript more easily. Although, I mean, there's definitely some pain points with testing JavaScript, but it's like light years better than the days of like Selenium.
One more question. Angular uses dirty checking for its check its model changes, I believe, and so there's been some talk about that being a performance issue, a performance problem you might hit up against. Did you come into that at all while you're doing this?
Yeah, so one performance problem I did hit was having too many objects, and Angular does degrade in performance if there's a lot of objects. But an easy way I found to rectify that was simply to switch to using ngIf or the switch statement instead of ng-show and hide, because that will actually remove those objects from the DOM instead of leaving them there and just hiding it using CSS.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I can answer any. Oh, one more question.
One more. You talked about before about the resolve and the promises, which I'd never seen before. Do you think that's a good way to deal with permissions?
Yeah, you can absolutely do that. So before you resolve a route, you can go ask the server whether this person has access to that particular URL, for sure.
Right, so as complex as the permissions can get, you could always go back and do it that way. Would you suggest doing that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, using resolve is a great way to do authentication.
Yeah, very cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
You still have a lot of time. It's only 4:33 or so.
Oh, okay.
Just if you want to continue.
I actually have a couple bonus levels. Sorry, like my phone completely died like 2 days ago, and so I have no idea what time it is. Not great for doing a presentation. But, so there are some bad smells. If you keep seeing this in your code or in the code base, it might be something that you want to look at refactoring. So if you're, as I mentioned, referencing DOM elements inside controllers, you always have the ability to reference a scope's parent by calling scope.$parent, but there's almost no good reason to, because if you call parent on it to get the parent scope, you're now making some assumptions about what's in the parent scope. So for example, before when we created our isolated scope on our directive, inside our directive, we can still call scope.parent to access the parent scope, but now you're breaking the isolated environment we created for our directive by calling that, so don't do it. Over-reliance on root scope. So there are times when you just want to like start attaching things to root scope because it's always available and you can get to it. It breaks encapsulation. Also, everything on the root scope has a shared namespace, so again, it's like making global variables, not a good idea. And also mentioned before, and similar, is using broadcast on root scope to broadcast events. So see if there's a way for you to use promises instead. Do you guys want to see more? This is just a random slide, but I thought I could reference it if anyone had questions about it. It's when does Angular run digest? So anytime an event handler happens within Angular land, like ng-click and so on, anytime there's a navigation event, so the URL changes using the route provider, anytime you make an HTTP call, so any of those Angular provided services like $HTTP, $timeout will trigger digest for you. If you're ever doing it on your own and you're just using set timeout or your jQuery has a callback, then Angular doesn't know about that and it's not going to call digest, and anything that you attach to the scope is not going to get updated in the view. And actually I can go back here and you'll notice that I called scope.$apply after, this is not great actually, I didn't write this very well. Apply, you can add a function to it and then do whatever you need inside the $apply, like that. And this is a better way to go because if there are any errors inside this thing here, then you'll know about it in the console. Otherwise, your errors just get swallowed up and you have no idea why your code doesn't work. So the reason I needed to call $apply here is because we're listing on a jQuery event and the jQuery callback doesn't trigger anything in Angular. So Angular doesn't know that our lives have updated and it can't do anything with that in the view or anywhere else you're relying on that property. Another thing that's kind of confusing and is when you should use a compile function in your directive versus link. So most of the time you can use link and you can do almost anything that you want to do in compile in a link function. But sometimes you want to just do it in compile. And the reason is that compile has a couple of advantages. It only runs once. So if you're doing something that doesn't rely on the scope being there, then you can run it in compile. And if it's included in an ng repeat, then it only runs once and all of the elements will get it, as opposed to link, which runs n times inside an ng repeat. So you might be thinking, well, why do I need a directive that doesn't rely on scope? So here I have an example of a static linky. So are you familiar with the filter linky in Angular? All it does is it finds some text, it finds the links in that text, and it makes links out of them. So I wanted to be able to use that filter on a static page, a page that does not have any Angular injecting content into it. So in essence, my page was the template, and I could call static linky like this with some text already inside the template and have Angular be able to filter this and create links out of them. So that's one example of why you might want to use compile. Another example is, let's say you use Bootstrap, and it's very verbose if you want to have like a small button and BTN small, BTN primary. It's just like you can have all these classes. So if you wanted to, you could write your own primary small button as an Angular directive, and all it does is it goes and adds all the classes that you want for that type of button. Yeah, about Tim.
Starts looking a little bit similar to web components. What would be your take? If you're using Angular, you would just create custom directories instead of custom tags to the components, or would you create it remotely?
Yeah, so I think in the future it'll be similar, as Mishko mentioned this morning. So you'll be able to export your Angular directives as web components. But I do see Angular directives as a superset of web components. There are, like as I showed, you can have Mario and have fire mode and 2 directives on the same element. You can't do that with web components. So there's some other things that you can do with directives that you can't with components. Yeah. But something simple like that, I think, yeah, definitely you can write it as a web component. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Still have 10 minutes if you want.
I think I'll let Peter come in and set up.